Liberalizmus vagy halál. Az elmúlt évtizedben a Republikon intézetben amolyan szállóigévé vált ez a mondat. Az előttünk álló beszélgetésekből talán az is kiderül majd miért. Politikáról, közéletről, aktuális eseményekről és a liberalizmus kérdéseiről beszélgetünk vendégeinkkel. Liberalizmus vagy halál? A Republikon Intézet podcastja.
Welcome everyone, this is Republicans Institute podcast, Liberalism or Death. We are presenting you a special English edition. We are after the Czech elections and we are honored to be joined by our guest Zuzana Stuchlíková from the Europeum Institute for European Policy based in Prague. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome. Please could you introduce yourself in a couple of sentences?
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for having me. It's always an interesting task to talk about the elections that happened only a couple of days ago, so you can imagine it will have some limitations, but happy to take on that. I work for Europeum as an associated researcher. Currently I'm also connected with their green team focusing on environmental issues. But yes, today I will put on my political researcher hat and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much for joining us. As you mentioned, the Czech elections just took place recently. Could you tell us more about what happened and what the main takeaways of the elections and the campaigns are?
So this election, just like basically every single election, were titled as the most influential, important ones that we've had until, since a very long time. To put it into a little bit more sober light, I would say that what happened is that democratic elections took place and there was a change of government, but this is something that in the Czech case is relatively usual. We've basically never seen that a party that would be a current governing party would win the elections again. So we have this tradition of swinging from one side to another. And in this case, it was a center-right coalition of first originally 5 parties, then 4 just before the elections, led by the Spolu coalition and Prime Minister Fiala, who were defending their position in government, and they lost the elections. The biggest coalition, Spolu, ended up in 2nd place, and it was the main until now opposition party ANO, led by Andrej Babiš, that won the elections quite convincingly, I have to say. It was more than 10 percentage points lead, so it is a relatively straightforward result that was expected for a long time. Basically the polls were showing approximately this result since the beginning of the year, so we can't really say. Of course there were little things we weren't sure about, but the outcome is pretty much what we expected. The main takeaways are that Andrej Babiš is the big winner. He got basically something over 80 MPs in the 200 MPs lower chamber of the Czech Parliament. And at the same time, he doesn't have a majority. He cannot rule on his own. So the success of his future government will rely hugely on his coalition partners. There now seems to be an obvious pattern for the next government, so he will likely join forces with the far-right SPD, which is basically the party of direct democracy, led by Tomio Okamura, and connected in this informal coalition with other far-right parties. And then with a little bit of a surprise of these elections, there's the motorists for themselves, that's the official name of the party, shortened to motorists. They managed to make it to the parliament for the first time. We would probably characterize them as also a right-wing populist party. They started focusing very much on one topic, but now we will see how that will come out. But they're really just like protecting the current automotive industry is their big theme, as you can tell from the name. So this is the pattern. Those are the three parties. We will see, this is not the ideal scenario for Andrej Babiš. He hoped to get a minority government supported by those two parties, because he knows that any form of coalition is going to be difficult for him to manage. Those are very strong personalities in charge of the other parties, so it's not going to be an easy job for him. But he probably will not have that choice, because those parties made it very clear that for them it's participation in the government or nothing. They have nothing to lose, even though they, for example, the SPD actually lost quite a lot in the elections compared to the previous cycle, so they're not really on a winning wave, but they know Babiš needs them. So we are now in a stage where the negotiations between those parties are taking place. We know this is the most likely pattern for the new government, and we're looking what happens also on other sides of the spectrum, but of course at this moment the main focus is going to be on those three parties. You mentioned what are the main takeaways. There's one important thing I would like to highlight, and that is that ahead of the elections we were focusing quite a lot on also one other extremist grouping, and that was the extreme left Stuchlíková, and even though they were expected to get up to 7-8%, they eventually didn't meet the 5% threshold, and they stayed out of the Chamber of Deputies. So this is also something that we can see as a trend, that the voters were not really supporting the extremes as much as we feared ahead of the elections. But I'm sure we'll get to details of that.
You mentioned that Babiš came back to parliament and to probably a leading position. What led to this comeback? Because it's not often that politicians come back after they lose. So what happened in the Czech society and in the election topics that led to his stellar comeback?
Well, I wouldn't say it's that rare, honestly. If we look at the comeback of Robert Fico, if we look at the comeback of Donald Trump, I think it starts to be a pattern that those people that you feel would unlikely come back, they seem to be coming back. And we might be surprised about it, but it is the new reality. But I think what really happened is that he never really lost in, I would say, like huge numbers. The past elections, which took place in 2021, were won by the outgoing centre-right coalition by really a narrow margin. And it was more like coincidence, because it was an election where more than 1 million votes actually wasn't really counted, or not counted, but wasn't translated into seats, because it was given, those votes were given to small parties that ended up outside of the parliament. And it's not really only about Andrej Babiš, it's really about his potential coalition partners. So if those smaller parties didn't gather this time and didn't go for the vote together, Andrej Babiš wouldn't have partners to form the coalition with, and he might have easily ended up in the opposition again. So it's one thing that he runs a successful campaign, but the fact that he is indeed back is also caused by a success of those smaller parties that didn't come out of nowhere. They've been always there, just better organized this time. On the other hand, what happened is that in the meantime, from 2021, the full-scale invasion to Ukraine happened. After that came the energy crisis with high prices, with inflation linked to that. So cost of living went up. This is not uniquely Czech experience. We've all seen it in Europe and worldwide. And this is something that the domestic audience is seen as a poor performing point of the current government, that really it was not delivering the results that even their own voters hoped for. It was a coalition government of formerly 5 parties, now down to 4. And what we've seen was that a lot of reforms which were promised, like, I don't know, pension reform, they were promised in a much more ambitious way than what was delivered afterwards. But this is what happens fairly often. I feel like if you have coalition governments, that the eventual compromise is not really what you would hope for from the ambitious promises ahead of the election. So basically, the voters were disappointed, their own voters, and they were unable to convince anyone from the opposition camp that they should vote for them. So when we look at it, basically the society remains just as divided as ahead of the last elections. It's just the electoral mathematics that worked better this time for ANO. But we also have to give credit to Andrej Babiš, who is, he's authentic in the way he communicates with his audiences, and it somehow works. There's, of course, like from the I would say political scientist perspective or economist scientist, there's plenty of points where we are kind of rolling our eyes and questioning how does ANO come to those conclusions and those promises which we see in their program and so on. But it seems to work. The campaign seems to work very well for its intended audience. So I would say it's really a combination of factors, as always.
Babiš went through a lot of political journeys, so to speak. How well do you think the current coalition with the far-right parties would be a good fit for Babiš right now, and how organically do you think they are a match?
It's a better match than for Babiš 10 years ago, when he was a self-proclaimed liberal, part of Renew Europe back then. He, as you suggest, he went a long way since then. He appealed to leftist audiences. Then he became a conservative leader, and now he's a nationalist. He really doesn't have one label. It doesn't work with him. So in many ways, he will go on well with the coalition partners, because, for example, on migration, his rhetoric is incredibly harsh. On even like little things, like how, those are not little things, but relatively minor topics within the domestic debate, they can agree on, but the big themes where you can find some joining points is really the resistance to be more active, proactive on helping Ukraine. It's not necessarily a switch to Russia. I wouldn't suspect that this is the case, because we haven't seen signs from Andrej Babiš. On the other hand, we've heard this from Tomio Okamura and from SPD, the far-right party. The motorists, again, they are actually claiming to support Ukraine, so we will have to see how this plays out. But basically, looking at those three parties, Andrej Babiš will find himself in the very unlikely scenario of being the moderate one. He doesn't know that, because previously he's always been the most outspoken, the most radical one in his previous governments. And this is going to be a situation where he needs to tone it down. And we've already seen it when in the debates just following the elections, Tomio Okamura, who was facing police investigation for actually inciting kind of hate crimes through his campaign, he used his position to say that if he gets to control the Ministry of Interior, he would first and foremost exchange the chief of police. And we've seen that for Andrej Babiš, like he saw this as a dangerous way to go. So then he stepped in, and now it seems like it's not going to be the case, that he wouldn't grant this portfolio to SPD. So he found himself, I feel like, in a very new situation for himself, of actually trying to moderate the discussion of people who go to much bigger extremes than he does. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. They will definitely, I mean, I don't doubt that they will find a common way, because all three of those parties want to form the coalition, because they have everything to gain and nothing, well, not nothing to lose, but they wouldn't gain anything from not being part of the governing coalition. But at the same time, it's three parties which have very different basis of existence, very different voter core, and they have very strong figures as their leaders. So I think this is going to be also interesting to follow their personal interactions and how the chemistry between them is going to work or not.
Do you think that if the coalition does manage to hold and happen, that Babiš will be able to moderate the extremities, or it will be the other way around and the extremities will pull Babiš further to the radical side?
I think this is the big question, really. We don't know at this moment, and this is also where it remains to be seen who are the personalities who eventually will end up in the government. This is also where the president can play a role, because it is eventually him who appoints the ministers, who appoints the whole government. And he already made it clear ahead of the elections that he wouldn't appoint anyone who would question Czech position in EU or NATO. And this is kind of addressed to those potential ministers from SPD, because they've been during the campaign questioning the Czech role in EU and NATO. They wanted a referendum to get out, actually, and Babiš repeatedly said that this is something that is a red line for him and he doesn't want to do it. So let's hope that's the case. So we don't know. It might be the president who will play the moderating part, but it's also like this is all happening without really a strong precedent, because in the past there were presidents who were very actively voicing their discontent with some nominees, but we never really had it kind of approved by the Constitutional Court that this is a competency of the president. So it's more about an informal pressure about the discussion between the president and the designated prime minister. So this remains to be seen. But also SPD, being aware of the situation, they even admitted that maybe it wouldn't have to be their core members in the government, but it could be experts nominated on behalf of SPD. So this might be a way around, that they will kind of play the two-level game. They will say like, oh, we nominated the experts, we are in the government, but at the same time it might be a scenario which will be easier for Babiš to accept, for the president to accept, and therefore for Babiš to manage potentially. But we are too close to the elections to have answers to those questions.
And now from Czech politics to a more international question, how similar do you think the Czech election, the results of the Czech elections and the fears of it being an illiberal government, how similar is this illiberalism, do you think, to the other countries in the V4, like Hungary and Slovakia, and what's happening in Poland?
I think there are similar patterns, of course, and what we see is that all those parties came to power fueled by dissatisfaction of the voters with the performance of the previous government, and kind of because all those parties have those populist elements in them. I feel that it's quite important that they're offering easy solutions. And this is something that it's not just the other V4 countries. This is something that we see across Europe. This is something we see in a world where kind of we're turning inwards, where the politicians are arguing that now it's time to put the country X, you can fill in whichever that is first, and to not spend money on the Ukrainian refugees and not send money to ammunition initiatives and things like that. Basically pretending that we don't need to care about the world around us because we can just look inwards. This is a very dangerous point, I think, to get to. But I think there are also differences in each country. And I feel, the setup of having strong institutions around those populist leaders is what makes a difference, what plays a role. So for me, it's just too early to say about how this potential illiberal twist in Czechia would look like. I'm not really sure whether it will be possible, looking back, it will be possible to call it like that. I mean, it might be worse. I have no idea. We have potentially fascist party in the government. So I feel we are really at a stage where we have to wait and see to how to label it, how to assess it. At the start, I would hope that the fact that the current ruling coalition doesn't have a majority in the Senate, they don't have the president, they won't be able to push for so many things from the illiberal wish list, if we call it like that. But there will be definitely points which we've seen in other V4 countries, and one of them, which could be relatively among the first ones on the menu, is the fight against public broadcasters, the Czech TV and Czech radio, which basically are currently paid for from contribution from citizens, and it is independent on the state budget. But as both the SPD and ANO are very much hating on those institutions and saying that they are not impartial and that they are against them and so on. So this is something that we might actually see, and this is where they might be looking for inspiration in the other V4 countries. So I'd say it's too early to say. There are scenarios where they can be inspired, but there are also many differences, so we'll have to wait and see.
You mentioned that the Czech society is probably fed up with their Czech duties on Ukraine and to international organizations, and they want to focus more on local problems. This is a trend, I think, in many countries. How do you see it featuring how to balance caring for your own people and then caring for the international community, because our region still is lagging behind Western Europe, where these issues are less divisive? Yeah. Do you think it's a big problem in this area that trying to help Ukraine could cause a lot of problems because there are still people we need to care of in the region?
I think it can never be one or the other. Every government will always need to find some sort of balance between working domestically and being active on the international scene. And again, this is something that we've seen to a great degree in the US after the election. This is something that we see in the UK quite a lot. So this is quite a universal dilemma that the governments are facing. Of course, in Czechia, it's a country which per capita actually accepted the largest amount of refugees, and from Ukraine, I mean. And even though studies show that economically it's been purely beneficial for the country and that those people are actually contributing to the state budget much more than they are taking from it, politically it still remains sensitive, and this is what we've seen, that those extremist parties or even ANO are really using in their campaigns and trying to benefit from this narrative of like, we're not going to be giving money to Ukrainians, we're going to give it to Czech people. I think it just shows that the social policy is really the problem, because you wouldn't need to take the refugees or people needing extra protection into that equation if you actually had a functioning domestic social policies. And this is again something that I fear is quite universal, that we see that the social systems in countries which are actually getting older are getting under pressure, and the refusing of migration is not helping the issue. So it's kind of a vicious circle of what the politicians are presenting as solutions and what might actually be the solutions. But it's a difficult balancing game, that is for sure. But I just feel it's very, very dangerous to present it as like one can be the priority and the other thing we can ignore, because it's not either or. It's always have to be like the both things have to be present, and especially in a country which has taken in so many people, we just cannot now pretend that's not the case. And I think this is going to be one of the challenges of the new government, because they have made those promises and then they will have to find a way to deliver on it and yet not hurt the country's budget and things like that. which is going to be actually on the social front also fairly difficult, because when you look at the promises of Andrej Babiš ahead of the elections, and SPD as well, all the economists agree that the economic promises are not realistic, really. So the budget deficit is likely to grow, and it's going to get under pressure. So I feel like the rhetorics that they chose are potentially attractive for some kind of voters, but they're also setting them up for a fail in a long-term perspective.
Do you think that the current Czech results are emboldening illiberal voices throughout the world, specifically in the V4 countries, by legitimizing what, for example, Orbán is saying on Ukraine and on certain common topics? Do you think there's an effect of escalation of illiberalism?
I think for people who want to see it as such, it will play that role, for sure. I don't think it universally has to mean that, because we can also look at positives. The liberal voices got more percentage than, you know, those crazy far right people. But of course, if you want to make that point that it increases the legitimacy of those policies, you can make it, and you can make it based on many other things, like the fact that Marine Le Pen is so strong in France, or that Reform Party is getting so much support in the UK. I feel like it feeds into those narratives that this is something that is becoming mainstream, that is no longer extreme. And we've seen that now, that in the past, voters of ANO sometimes would be ashamed to admit that they're voting for ANO. This has switched completely, because now ANO is such a mainstream that nobody sees it as anyhow controversial, so they're totally fine to say that. And it was the motorists who ran on a campaign a few weeks before the elections saying that vote for us, nobody has to know. And it was basically that, like, people are ashamed to say it out loud, and nobody has to know, then maybe give us a bit more vote. And it seemed to have worked, because they eventually managed to have over 6%, and this was something that still in the middle of summer nobody would have predicted. So yeah, I feel like this is something that we see in general, the normalization of those voices, and to a certain degree then it can feed into those narratives that this is the prevailing way of looking at things, and it can be in a way a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Do you think that liberals have the duty of trying to counter illiberalism, or should it come from another ideological area, and what can be done, what could liberals do better or differently to counter illiberalism and the trends?
I think I struggle with the definition of like have the duty of. It's like if you're against something, you want to do that, right? Like it's not like it's a duty of somebody. It's more like if you think it's wrong, well then of course you want to do something with it. And honestly, I don't know who else than people who think it's wrong should do something about it, right? Like it's unlikely to expect that ANO will have its own voters who will be like, we voted for this, but we think it's going a bit too far. Like that would be a lovely world, but we don't live in such. So I feel there's always a need for an active opposition, for an active civil society, for a debate to be held, for like constructive criticism of what those parties in power are doing. So I feel that's definitely a must for all of us and the politicians, the liberal politicians, of course, in the first place. But then as well, I know that in the Czech case, there are two parties which we can call liberal, probably. I've always struggled with those labels, and I feel like most of their members would struggle with that as well, because some of them will define themselves in completely different terms. But for simplification purposes, let's call them liberal. But together they have approximately not even 20% of the vote. So if we say that the responsibility solely lies with liberal voices, I mean, what are you going to do with the 20% in opposition, right? Like, we cannot blame them if they're not successful in countering the actual governmental majority. But they have a very important role to play in bringing up the topics and being active in calling out whatever happens. If those are things which are crossing the lines and so on. So I feel everyone has a role to play, and it is really a whole society that must contribute to the change, because it is a majority of society that actually brings those illiberal voices to the power. And it, frightening as it might be, this is a reality we have to accept, that it's not, we cannot, in Central European case, we cannot say it's the elections that were stolen. Those are of course there are issues that come to play, but in the very basic principles, and in Czechia for sure, those are democratic, fair elections. So it's really about working with the electorate rather than just countering the politicians as such in what they're saying.
You mentioned that institutions, the whole illiberal turn will depend on the strength of illiberalism, will depend on the strength of institutions.
Yes.
We have seen in the US that Trump is very effectively dismantling the checks and balances and the institutions. What do you think could happen in Czechia, and what could you mentioned it's up to society to stop illiberal trends. Can society help maintain the institutions?
I think it's about the attention that is given to it, for sure. But of course, from a position of somebody who's not part of any of the institutions, you cannot proactively help it. But I think it's going to go down to that. And in Czechia, we're quite lucky to have, there is the Senate, where the upcoming government will not have a majority. There is the Constitutional Court, which will have a final say in many things. One of the big things is going to be a conflict of interest of Andrej Babiš, something that's been ongoing since the first time he entered politics, because he is a billionaire who owns basically the whole agricultural business in Czechia, and not only in Czechia. So this is always going to be the case, and the rules have tightened since the last time he's been in power. The European rules have tightened, so so in this, the courts will have actually an essential role to play, because until this day he didn't present a concrete scenario on how he wants to deal with that conflict of interest. But there is a check, and there is a European law saying that a person in the conflict of interest cannot be in a position of a prime minister. So it's going to be those checks and balances which will play a role eventually. Whether he'll be able to go around it, of course there are ways. It's a Czech law currently, and the law can be changed if you have a majority in the Chamber of Deputies, right? There are other ways around it. When it comes to personal appointments, we've also seen that Babiš has been in the past very good at appointing his people to various positions of influence. Those were mostly people from his holding from Agrofert, and that's how the term agrofertization of Czechia came around. It basically means that the state and his company are kind of interlinked at more levels than you would expect. So those are the challenges, but it can also prove that the institutions are strong. We have the position of a president who actually is the one who has to nominate name the government and so on. So I think the checks and balances are there. Now it's just about how the people in those positions will play it out. What we will have to see is how the Chamber of Deputies will look like, because one of the likely scenario is that Tomio Okamura, head of the SPD, could become the chair of the lower house of parliament. And then what can be done is, and this is something that the commentators are saying, that his party feels like it's been sidelined in the past parliament, so they can try to sideline basically the current opposition from leadership position within committees and so on. So there are ways how those institutional checks and balances can be made difficult. And overall, basically how the sessions of the Chamber of Deputies are looking, this would be for a completely different podcast, because it's really wild what's sometimes happening in the Czech Parliament. But I think this is something that's yet to be seen, how the institutions are going to handle it. But I wouldn't be too pessimistic about the setup. The position of Czech Prime Minister is not comparable to the position of US President. So it's not going to be as easy for Babiš as it is for Trump to dismantle the system. But I wouldn't like for him to take it as a challenge.
And on this optimistic note that institutions are strong and Babiš is not as strong as Trump, I would like to thank you for talking to me, and thank you for participating in this podcast. This has been the podcast of the Republican Institute, Liberalism or Death. I've been Máté Hajba, and you can check out our channels in the description, and we are looking forward to the next podcast where you can join us in the channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ha tetszett a beszélgetés, iratkozz fel a platformon, ahol podcastokat hallgatsz, és kövesd a Republicont a Facebookon, az Instagramon és a YouTube-on is. Ha pedig hozzászólnál a témához, kommentelj bátran, és gyere el a következő konferenciánkra, ahol egy kávé mellett személyesen is beszélgethetünk.